The story of the financial collapse of the Ottoman Empire stands as one of the most instructive examples of sovereign debt catastrophe in world history. This was not a sudden collapse that occurred overnight, but rather a gradual and methodical decline that slowly extracted resources from what had once been a mighty state, year after year, until it finally surrendered control over its own destiny and future. The essence of this financial tragedy lay not merely in the numbers and interest rates, though these figures were significant and telling, but rather in the systemic weakness of an enormous yet hopelessly outdated state apparatus that proved incapable of adapting to the realities of the modern global capital markets and the new rules of international finance that emerged in the 19th century. Until the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had never resorted to foreign borrowing. Throughout nearly 500 years of continuous imperial rule, the state had relied entirely on its internal resources, taxing its vast population and maintaining a traditional system of finance through local banking, families and merchants, particularly the influential communities living in the Galata district of Constantinople. However, the world was changing with remarkable speed and relentless force. European states, especially France and Britain, had accumulated enormous quantities of capital through their industrial revolutions and colonial enterprises, and they actively sought new opportunities abroad to invest this wealth and generate returns. At precisely the same moment, the Ottoman Empire had begun to recognise that its military institutions and its sprawling administrative system urgently required comprehensive modernisation to remain competitive and relevant. The Tanzimat reforms, which commenced in 1839, embodied this recognition and called for the creation of a modern army patterned after European models, the construction of railways and telegraph networks, the establishment of new government ministries, and the introduction of novel principles of rational administration and centralised control. All of these ambitious projects demanded enormous quantities of capital. The growing gap between what the state needed to spend and what it could raise through traditional taxation became the first warning sign of the financial crisis that would eventually consume the empire. The Crimean War, which erupted in 1853 and continued until 1856, became the pivotal moment in Ottoman financial history. The Sultan sought to preserve Ottoman European territories against Russian imperial expansion, and achieving this objective required securing active military assistance from powerful European states. Britain and France agreed to become Ottoman allies against Russia, but this alliance came at a substantial price. Initially, the Ottoman government attempted to finance the war through traditional domestic borrowing from the Galata bankers, wealthy merchant families who had provided credit to sultans for centuries. Yet these sources proved inadequate when faced with the enormous scale of wartime military expenditure. In 1854, the Ottoman government turned for the first time to European capital markets in search of substantial foreign loans. Britain formally guaranteed these credits, signalling its support for the Ottoman cause, and this guarantee opened an entirely new chapter in the empire's financial history. The first foreign loan totaled £3 million sterling and nominally carried an interest rate of 6%. However, the most important detail was this. The bonds were not sold at face value, but rather at a substantial discount of approximately 20%. In effect, by borrowing money today at a discount, the state was obligating itself to pay back considerably more in real terms in the future, thereby entering immediately into a cycle of financing at disadvantageous terms. This was the first signal of how international capital markets evaluated the financial risk of lending to an Ottoman state that was perceived as militarily overstretched and financially fragile. When the Crimean War finally concluded in 1856, Ottoman officials entertained hopes that the financial crisis would similarly fade away, along with wartime military expenditures. This hope proved to be tragically naive. The borrowed funds had already been spent, the resources had flowed out of the imperial treasury and disappeared into military logistics and compensation. Rather than working seriously to repay what had been borrowed, the state found itself compelled to take out new loans simply to service the older debt obligations and to continue financing its expanding bureaucratic apparatus. This inaugurated a cycle of perpetual borrowing that would characterize Ottoman financial policy for the next 2 decades. In 1858, the government borrowed £5 million. In 1860, it borrowed £8 million, this time backed by positive assessments from a British financial commission that temporarily restored market confidence. Beyond these foreign loans, Ottoman authorities made the strategic decision to undertake an ambitious program of railway construction, envisioning these modern transportation networks as the key to economic development and territorial integration. Yet railways in the Ottoman domain were primarily financed through foreign capital, particularly through investments by French and British corporations and financiers. This pattern repeated itself year after year. Between 1869 and 1874, virtually every single year brought new foreign borrowing, and with each new loan came more stringent terms and higher interest rates than had been negotiated for previous loans. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman economy had entered a state of chronic financial stress and fundamental imbalance. Internal tax revenues had been nearly exhausted by the insatiable demands of the central state. Peasants and craftsmen throughout the empire went hungry, which simultaneously undermined the tax base and created spreading social discontent. The system for collecting taxes was notoriously corrupt and drastically inefficient. Tax records were frequently falsified by local administrators, and a substantial portion of collected revenues remained in the private pockets of officials rather than reaching the imperial treasury. Simultaneously, the empire experienced persistent monetary inflation characteristic of states in financial distress. When Sultan Mahmud II had ascended to the throne in 1808, one British pound could be exchanged for only 19 Ottoman piastres. Yet by the time of his death, merely 3 decades later, that same pound now required 106 piastres in exchange. The Ottoman currency was losing value at an alarming rate, with devastating consequences for ordinary people, and severely hampering both imports and exports. As the currency weakened, foreign goods became prohibitively expensive, while Ottoman exports became less competitive in international markets. Precisely at this critical juncture, in 1873, the global economy experienced the first truly worldwide financial crisis of the modern age. The collapse of the New York Stock Exchange sent shockwaves reverberating through every financial center in Europe. European investors, seized by panic and fear of losing capital, hastily began liquidating their positions in risky foreign markets, including and especially the Ottoman bond market. Ottoman securities, which had already been viewed with suspicion by serious investors concerned about financial viability, suddenly became utterly toxic and unsellable. At this exact moment, the Ottoman territories were also struck by devastating natural disasters. A severe drought in 1873 caused harvests to fail dramatically. The following year brought catastrophic flooding that destroyed much of the agricultural land across the empire. The peasantry, normally existing at mere subsistence levels, found itself pushed toward the brink of famine and starvation. Particularly in the Balkan regions and rural areas, entire communities faced genuine hunger. The Ottoman government attempted to provide humanitarian relief by distributing stored food supplies to prevent mass starvation, but this charitable expenditure required additional financing that simply did not exist in the imperial treasury. By 1874, the situation had deteriorated to a critical breaking point beyond which there could be no return to stability. The Galata bankers, the traditional creditors of the Ottoman state for many centuries, announced that they would no longer extend credit to the government, even at the extraordinarily high interest rate of 85%. Their ancient confidence in the Ottoman state had been completely exhausted. This moment represented a psychological turning point in how European financiers evaluated Ottoman creditworthiness. Moreover, the state lacked sufficient foreign currency earnings to honour its debt service obligations. By 1875, the Ottoman government found itself inexorably approaching absolute financial collapse. The mathematics of the situation were unmistakable. By this date, the total nominal public debt stood at approximately £242 million sterling. The annual interest and amortization payments on this debt totaled approximately £12 million per year. The entire government revenue collected from all sources of taxation amounted to merely £21 million annually. Stripped of all rhetorical flourish, this meant that more than half of every coin collected by the state had to go directly towards servicing foreign debt. Even if the government had no other expenses whatsoever, it physically lacked the resources to meet its obligations. The mathematics of the situation admitted no solutions through conventional means. On October 6, 1875, the Sultan made an announcement that shook the financial world. The Ottoman government declared that it could no longer meet its debt repayment obligations and would unilaterally suspend interest payments on its foreign loans. The decree, known as the Rescript of Ramadan, sent waves of panic through European financial markets. Investors faced enormous losses, many fortunes were destroyed. British and French newspapers published accounts of the catastrophe. International negotiations among European creditors commenced immediately, as they could not simply absorb such massive losses. This was an era when European states were actively expanding their control over weakened neighbours, and financial control had emerged as one of the most effective instruments through which this expansion could be accomplished. The Ottoman default seemed to provide precisely the legal and moral justification that European powers needed to intervene directly in Ottoman affairs. In 1876, a new sultan, Abdul Hamid II, attempted to mobilise the state in response to the crisis. Ottoman authorities proposed constitutional reforms intended to impose order and transparency on government finances. In December 1876, the Ottoman government issued its first constitution. This document was intended to regulate government spending and revenues, introduce more transparent accounting systems, and theoretically preserve Ottoman sovereignty against foreign financial control. However, the constitution proved too weak to address the fundamental insolvency that had gripped the state. The empire remained hopelessly insolvent and incapable of paying its obligations. Almost simultaneously with these constitutional experiments, a new military catastrophe unfolded. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 brought absolute financial disaster to the Ottoman state. Military expenditures consumed the last remaining reserves of foreign exchange and coined metals. According to contemporary accounts, by the war's conclusion, the imperial treasury had been so thoroughly exhausted that state officials and even ordinary soldiers went without salaries for months on end. Naval personnel mutinied. Civil servants abandoned their posts. Despair was universal. The peace treaty negotiated in Berlin in July 1878 inflicted enormous territorial losses on the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman possessions in Europe were dramatically reduced, and the state was forced to undertake complete reconstruction of its diplomatic and military strategy. Yet the strangest paradox of this entire situation was that the default actually resulted in a more complete loss of sovereignty than would have occurred had the Ottoman state continued struggling to make payments while remaining nominally independent. In 1881, following intense international negotiations, Ottoman authorities were forced to accept a new decree known as the Rescript of Muharrem. This document established a remarkable new institution called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or OPDA. This agency, controlled by representatives of European creditor states and staffed primarily by European officials, was granted the explicit authority to collect certain taxes, customs duties, and excise taxes from throughout Ottoman territory. In concrete terms, the most productive and most readily monitored sources of state revenue, such as maritime customs duties and the tax on salt, were transferred under the control of foreign administrators. While the Ottoman Empire nominally retained its sovereignty, it had now effectively surrendered control over the most valuable portion of its economic system. The OPDA operated directly from the centre of Constantinople, enjoying the active protection and military support of European diplomatic representatives and naval forces. It possessed quasi-royal status, maintaining its own police and customs officials. This foreign institution established strict rules governing tax collection and revenue distribution. It employed Europeans and other foreigners in senior administrative positions, introduced new systems of bookkeeping and financial record-keeping, and compelled local Ottoman officials to conform to certain European standards of financial management. Most significantly and symbolically, the OPDA possessed the power to remove and replace Ottoman governors and regional administrators who failed to comply with its directives. In this way, the European financial system gained direct access to the Ottoman administrative apparatus itself. What historians refer to as peripheral integration, or semi-colonial dependency, meant that the Ottoman state progressively surrendered control over its own economy and became dependent on decisions made far away in the financial centres of London and Paris. The empire was no longer truly independent. It had become a financial colony of European capital, a state within the state designed to extract resources and channel them to foreign creditors. Perhaps the most extraordinary paradox in this entire tragedy was that despite the establishment of this foreign oversight institution, and despite the formal default, the Ottoman government continued to borrow persistently and repeatedly, taking out new loans almost annually. Notwithstanding the recent default, and notwithstanding the establishment of direct European control over the most important revenue sources, the state continued to incur new foreign debt, each time under progressively worse and more onerous terms. Each new loan came with higher interest rates, and much of each new loan was used to service previous obligations. This represented the classic debt trap in which new borrowing is used to finance old debt payments, creating a cumulative spiral of decline and desperation. By 1914, when World War I commenced, the total Ottoman public debt had reached £139 million, and the empire remained deeply and completely dependent on European financiers for its very survival. This was not simply bankruptcy in the conventional economic sense. It was a gradual and systematic loss of political sovereignty disguised beneath the neutral language of financial control and objective financial administration. Once European powers gained control through the OPDA over the most productive tax revenue streams flowing to the Ottoman state, they had effectively gained the power to shape Ottoman strategic decisions and future development. They could block military expenditures if they judged that resources should go to servicing European debt. They could dictate trade policy, demanding that the empire generate sufficient foreign exchange for prompt debt payment. They could attach political conditions to new loans, compelling Ottoman officials to accept European demands and preferences simply in order to obtain the short-term financing necessary for state survival. European financial control had become the true source of Ottoman political authority. The Ottoman elite found themselves caught in an impossible position. They could not develop their economy in ways that European creditors viewed as threatening to repayment capacity. They could not maintain large military establishments if creditors judged such expenditures wasteful. They could not pursue independent foreign policies if such policies risked antagonizing the great powers from whom they required continued access to credit. Financial dependency had become political dependency, and Ottoman sovereignty had become little more than a formal fiction. The empire continued to exist nominally, but its policies and future were increasingly determined by financial agents answerable to European capitals, rather than to the Ottoman Sultan. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed and ceased to exist in 1922 and was succeeded by the Turkish Republic, one of the new government's early and serious acts was to attempt to come to terms with the financial inheritance from the previous era. The Turkish Republic continued to make payments toward the old Ottoman debts well into the middle of the 20th century, formally discharging financial obligations that European creditors had imposed more than a century earlier. In fact, the final payment on Ottoman debt was made by Turkey in 1954, nearly 80 years after the original default. That debt outlived the empire itself. It persisted as a symbol of how modern financial mechanisms and debt instruments can function as powerful tools for the gradual erosion of state sovereignty and the restructuring of global power systems in favour of those who control capital flows and international financial markets. The Ottoman debt crisis did not end in sudden revolutionary collapse. Instead, it concluded through a more subtle but equally profound mechanism: the internal transformation of the state apparatus itself into an instrument serving European financial interests. The empire had become a mechanism for channeling wealth and resources from the periphery to the financial centres of European civilization, systematized and rationalized through the language of contracts and financial obligations. Each government official, each provincial administrator, each customs collector became an agent working not primarily for the Ottoman state, but for the system of debt repayment controlled by European creditors. In this way, the Ottoman Empire did not simply fall to military conquest or sudden political revolution. It was systematically incorporated into an emerging global economic system, in which sovereign states lost the power to control their own financial destinies. This transformation occurred gradually and was barely visible to contemporaries. Ottoman officials could point to the formal continuance of the Sultanate, to the continued existence of Ottoman institutions and ceremonies. Yet behind this facade, the essential powers of sovereignty had been transferred elsewhere. The empire continued to exist as a geographic and demographic entity, but it had ceased to exist as an autonomous political and economic force. Its future was now written in the ledgers of European banks and determined by decisions made in distant financial centres by men who held Ottoman bonds and who viewed the empire primarily as a financial asset to be managed for maximum return. The debt crisis of the Ottoman Empire thus represents far more than a mere failure of economic management or a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive borrowing. It demonstrates how financial instruments can serve as mechanisms of imperial control and subjugation, how debt can become the means through which powerful states extract sovereignty from weaker ones, and how the modern international financial system has developed alongside and in service to great power domination. The Ottoman experience was repeated in numerous other contexts throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, creating a pattern in which smaller states with resource needs found themselves surrendering control to foreign creditors in exchange for financing. This pattern continues even in the contemporary world, where national governments often discover that their ostensible sovereignty masks a deeper financial dependency on international creditor institutions. The Ottoman case remains uniquely instructive because it shows with particular clarity how this process unfolded through legal mechanisms and contractual arrangements that appeared rational and apolitical. The OPDA was presented as a merely technical solution to an accounting problem. The rescript of Muharrem was framed as a reasonable compromise between creditors and debtors. The Constitution of 1876 was intended as a progressive reform, ensuring good governance. Yet each of these mechanisms, however they were justified at the time, functioned as steps in a broader process of subjugating Ottoman state power to European financial interests. The empire had not been conquered by armies, but it had been colonized by capital. And this form of colonization, being less visible and less overtly violent than military conquest, proved in some respects more complete and more durable than traditional imperial occupation. It persisted long after the Ottoman Empire itself had disappeared, binding even the successor Turkish state to obligations and constraints inherited from the era of Ottoman financial dependency.